So here we are again with Mark from Moz Customs, and today we're going to do a upgrade to the board that I've got. It comes with pads. However, as I'm getting older and my joints are getting sore, I'm finding these pads to be a bit too unforgiving and hard. So Mark suggested I go for a thicker foam. So I've sourced this 10mm EVA foam, and then on top of that we're going to put a what would you call that, Mark? That's
well, this is the normal stuff we use for boards. It's got 3M sticky back on it. It's really good sticky. I think it's a 5mm but diamond cut. You can buy this at a lot of surf shops or online.
Yeah.
So that 5mm diamond cut, of course, is what's on the board already, but we're just going to back it up with some really nice thick stuff to make some really plush pads for you.
Yeah, so Mark suggested I get like a 5 or 6mm EVA foam, but I'm in Geraldton and stocks are limited. I found a 10mm EVA foam at Spotlight, so they're going to be an extra thick pad, but that's okay. It just means it's probably going to end up being more comfortable underfoot. So that's what we're doing today. And what do we need to do this job, Mark?
All right, apart from the foam, obviously, there's a few other things. Glue and obviously a knife to cut it. That's fairly obvious, but some other things that might not be so obvious the first time you do it. So starting at the beginning, going back to this EVA here, I've found with some of them that they leave a little bit of a mold release or some kind of product on there that the glue doesn't stick that well. So I've now started with this stuff to clean it really well. So sanding it with like a really rough, like 60 grade or 80 grade sandpaper to score it, and then cleaning it really well with wax and grease remover, which you've seen us do with our paint jobs. Forgot to get that one out. Same as when we're painting, a good wax and grease remover, because if there's anything on there that's going to stop it from adhering, you're just going to end up with those pads peeling apart eventually. So sandpaper, prep wash to clean up the black stuff. Then obviously we're going to glue it. It's a contact adhesive. This is the stuff that you put on both sides, and then you let it dry. And then when it's almost dry, pressing the two together, it becomes a permanent bond. Lots of people use quick grip. It's probably the most common one, certainly in Australia. I do prefer though, and even better, it's cheaper, the Proffitt. It's a little bit runnier. A little bit runnier makes it easier to spread. We're then obviously going to cut it with a knife. Big tip here, brand new blade every cut. You will have a blade that'll cut just fine, but cutting through that much thickness at the bottom, if it's not sharp, it'll just tear a tiny bit and you'll end up with a rough edge on it. So brand new blade every time. Don't be stingy. You're probably going to need, use at least 2 blades to cut these pads out. After the pads are cut out, we're going to melt a nice hole in it for the screw holes by heating up the nail and putting the hole through for the foot strap screws. Spreading glue out. We are going to use the glue to glue these 2 sheets together. Even though this is self-adhesive and it will stick to that, we can certainly get a much better result by just putting a small amount of that glue on this surface. So we're just going to rough it just a little bit. Don't have to go nuts. And we're not worried about getting every last little bit, because I'm going to cut the pads out, here somewhere. We don't have to get to the very edge. Don't have to be flash, make a bit of mess. And then rub it down with the wax and grease remover. However, I want to get rid of all of that nasty dust first, so I'm just going to blow it off with a bit of air, but vacuum cleaner or brushing it off would do just as well, but it's nice to be able to cheat sometimes. And now a good scrub. Now, of course, part of the reason we use EVA is it doesn't absorb water and stuff, so it's not going to absorb the cleaner that we're using here. And if you don't have wax and grease remover, you could possibly get away with some sort of thinners and that, but I would test it first, make sure it's not going to melt everything. So, it was probably clean before, but playing it safe. Now while that's drying, that could take, you know, 20 minutes to get nice and dry perhaps. We have to remove the pads. Pad removal is a little bit of an art. Scalpel, or as I said, a brand new blade on one of these. Lots of blade length helps though. And very, very carefully, starting with an edge there. I'm going to be careful that we don't attack the board over here with the point. So if we're doing a full repair, we don't really care about gouges, but we want this to be nice. So once you get it started though, it becomes a lot easier. So once we've got it started, we can then start working at it. And as I said before, Paul's a bit like filleting a fish. Pads that are made well, like these, come away nice and easy because they haven't got a heap of glue. You'll find a board that's been repaired sometimes. They've used way too much of the glue that I showed you in the can, and they become a bit difficult to remove. And we'll come back when we're done. Once we're past the halfway point, we really need to spin the board around and start work from here again. Because if we keep attacking it this way, we're eventually just going to tear that edge. Once we get down to here, we need to start like we did on the other side, right on this very edge.
Voila.
Number 2.
That's it. So just put the foot straps back on and we're done.
Depends how much you want to save your knees.
Weight saver. What's the next step now that
we don't have to get every last little bit of this off. I mean, it looks a bit chunky, but it's not really. Most of this is very, very thin. We don't have to get that off. We'll definitely work at that. You're not going to feel these lumps and bumps, so you could stick them on straight over the top of that, but we'll get as much of that off as possible later. Next step is we're now going to bond. Where did we put the other foam? We're now going to bond the 2 sheets of foam together with, as I said, the Proffitt, because I prefer it 'cause it's a lot thinner. You can apply this with a paintbrush. You can spray it, which is not a heap of fun. You need to be well set up with a special spray gun and that. For this kind of application, I prefer to use a scraper so we can get it reasonably thin. So goopy mess. We don't want too much. As I said, we could just stick that other foam straight on there, but we really want to improve our chances of good adhesion. So just a nice thin layer. If you did it with a paintbrush, as I said, it would still work, but you would probably find your application is a lot more lumpy and bumpy and not quite as even.
That's quite a thin layer you've put on there, so that's...
It was a pretty good guesstimate of how much though too, isn't it? Try not to spend too long doing it too, because the whole idea of this is it dries really, really quick and becomes tacky really quite quick. So we haven't got long working in a shed in WA summer. Luckily it's a nice cool day. So now we're just going to let that sit for, well, you know, temperature dependent, but anything up to about 20 minutes if it's cool weather, but probably only about 5 or 10 in here. And when this has become tacky, and we'll show that in a moment, we'll put the other sheet on. Just take the thicker bits off. Worth mentioning too, we could get every last little bit of this off with a solvent if we wanted. Put a rag on there and soak it in thinners or something, and stuff like this will just completely just fall off. However, there's a danger to doing that, not with a stony board because you can't melt the insides very easily, but on most factory boards with a polystyrene core, you only need a tiny little hole in there, and if you're soaking all this in solvents, a tiny little hole can be enough for it to get in there and melt your core.
Yeah.
So sometimes spending 10 minutes with a blade might be better than doing the cheap method. Like I said, I'll be pretty confident that we could soak a whole bunch of thinners onto this, particularly being a stony, without damaging it, but rather just play it safe.
This is a polyester board, which is not the norm. Most people out there are going to have an epoxy production style board. So that's where you want to be careful with getting a hole in and then using solvents. So
Roger.
Therefore, we're recommending just going over it with the blade and cutting off the chunky bits.
Yeah, just the thick stuff. I reckon we're onto it. This is all pretty flat now. Those bits are wafer thin, so let's go and see how our glue's going. Yep, beautiful. This is set enough when you can still feel that it's tacky, but you can't move it like, see, that's too wet. Too wet, but when it won't come away on your fingers, and it's, you can still feel that it's a little bit wet. So, now the difficult and annoying part, because we don't want to get air bubbles in it. So like with many things, it's often better to just start with one straight edge. And fold it back. Well, I'm just going to peel that part back as we work across. And that's going to prevent us from getting any big air bubbles because we're working slowly across. Just pulling that one out as we go.
I just want to mention too, but I found it hard to find thick pads. True? It's hard to come by these days.
Yeah, there's a lot of factory pads that are made a bit thicker, but it's really hard to find replacement pads. I mean, lots of people buy this.
Yeah.
The SUP stuff's a little bit too thin, and this is probably just nice for windsurfing boards, but it's still too thin where it's cut away. That bit is still too thin to protect your board properly.
I bought this at Spotlight, 2 sheets. It came in a pack for $30, 30 Australian dollars.
Yeah, I've also bought it at Clark Rubber at about considerably more, but and on eBay as well, can be quite cheap.
And how much for the top part, the white part?
I bought this at Surf Sale Australia. Mark probably sells the best stuff that I've used, Mark at Surf Sale. Price versus quality sort of trade-off. You know, you can buy cheap stuff on eBay and the sticking back just doesn't work, it's rubbish. So I would definitely recommend the stuff from Mark at Surf Sale, or if you're over east, the stuff from Hydro Turf. The Hydro Turf from Australian Jet Ski Supplies, I've bought that before. They're both really good quality products. This sheet here, I've used some of it. I buy it in bigger sheets, but this sheet here is 600 by 900. I think is about $60. So you should get sort of 4 pads for your $60, adding on your 30. So you know, for $100 you can make pads for 2 boards, which is certainly better than spending $100 for the pads overseas that you've still pay freight on, and have some fun doing it. Alrighty, so now that this is bonded, we're just going to cut out the pads. A couple of different ways to do it, but firstly, think about on these diamonds, you can see that there's a bevel on this edge. That edge is straight. That edge has a bevel. So your foot will slide easily this way and not the other. Starboard brought out their fish scale pads, which I thought was a great idea because foot goes into the strap easy and won't come out that easily. So because this is a WA board and this is our jumping side, this is our jumping side. So most people, personal preference, but I think most people prefer the foot to go in easy on the jumping side and not come out easy, because you don't want your foot to fall out when you're in the air. So we're going to cut them in that orientation. You can cut this top stuff, spin it round when you glue it to the black foam on the bottom, and you can have both sides easy in and hard out, but then you end up with a joint along here that creates its own problems, and you have to glue that quite neatly and things like that. So the next thing is I can just cut around this with a blade now, but you tend to find that the existing pad kind of gets in the way when you're going around corners and that. So I'm going to draw it on first and cut just to the inside of the line, hopefully, so you don't end up with black texture on your pads. So just pinning it down so it can't move. Go and find grandma or mum and steal their dressmaking stuff.
Maybe guys are into dressmaking as well.
Sorry, I shouldn't be so sexist.
It's unlikely.
I certainly haven't met any dressmaker, windsurfer blokes at the beach, but there could be one out there watching the video, and we're not critical. Well, there's enough dots on there to follow the line. And that's the other thing that I probably should have mentioned too, that I forgot. The lining up that point and that point, the diamond pattern you can follow. So yeah, because we don't want it on the piss that way or something like that. So so now looking at this one, lining up that point there. Come up a little bit. So it's kind of hard because we lose the diamond, but we know that in between those two. So at least we're pretty straight from along the long axis of the board. Brand new blade again. Worth mentioning, quite often you cut the pad on an angle. It looks better with a bit of a bevel, but we're trying to get exact match for this board, so we don't have to worry about the line where the deck grip is and that. So I'm going to cut it vertically. If you do want to cut on an angle, all well and good, make sure it's the right way up, because you tend to find when you cut on an angle, any cutting, if it's going to tear, it'll tear at the bottom, not the top. So if you try and cut the pad upside down, you'd have to cut like that, and you probably tear the top side. So if you do want to cut on an angle, the right side up, but we're going to try and cut at 90 degrees as much as possible. And the other tip is to try not to stop and start your cut. If you cut and then start again, you often get a tear on that corner. So it can be quite difficult to follow a line. Let's hope we don't stuff up Paul's pads that he's paying for. And inside the line, just. Getting there. So yeah, that's worth demonstrating. You can see we've got a nice edge there. But I said if it's going to tear anyway, tear anywhere, it's always on the bottom of the cut. So you can see a few little tiny tears there. So it's always worth cutting it upright. Getting into this last little bit. And there we have a nicely duplicated pad.
Oh.
And of course, holding the blade vertical or not vertical, change the shape a little bit. Quite pleasing because if anything, this is a smidgen, tiny weeny bit narrower, and we're not too worried about being just a tiny bit narrower. We just don't want to be further out and have to bond it to where the deck grip is. So similarly cut out the other one and then show you how we go about making these holes. It's worth mentioning too that if you stuff bits up, you can sandpaper this. Normally when I use a router, it's a little bit rougher and I tidy it up with a little bit of sandpaper, but you can see on those corners there that you wouldn't think that you can sand foam, but you can actually tidy it up quite a bit more than you would expect. That's a bit, I guess, counterintuitive. You think of sandpapering hard things, but it does actually work quite well on foam. So some of those more difficult and tighter corners can be tidied up quite nicely. Done. Except, but now we need holes, and this can be very difficult. Now, quite often what I do here is, if these holes have become enlarged, you've got to be exact where you put those, plus or minus a millimetre or two. If these have become enlarged, it's worth making a template with baking paper or something that's see-through, and come on and line it up exactly, make a spot-on template, line it up, sticky tape it down, and mark these holes really, really accurately. But we haven't really damaged them. There's enough to work off there, but I do want to check that one and make sure that's right. Not finding them now.
You can move this way a little bit, yeah.
So. Right, so at least now I know that this one is not the hole we want, that one. Alrighty, some holes to work off. This one here, we didn't really stuff any of them up when we were cutting it out, so no need to go back to the board. Right, inside to make some fumes. Putting these holes in, we could quite easily drill them, but I found the drill bit quite often catches, and we don't want to ruin our nice work by tearing it. So I tend to melt them. What we've got here is a pair of multi-grips with a nail. And doing it under this hood here so it sucks that horrible smell away. Otherwise, outside with a blowtorch for the nail. Have some nice accurate holes, they're going to be spot on, line up. More cleaning like we did on the previous side rather, and we neglected that there was a sticker on. So now that we've cut our pad, I'm going to use some nails that are a little bit bigger than we did before, so they're nice and tight in the holes, so there can't be any movement. The reason for that will be clear later. but just using the nails to locate in the foot strap holes so this pad really doesn't have any movement. That will enable us to get a really accurate line for the gluing. Then while it's located, taping around under the pad, bit of overlap, doesn't really matter how much because we're going to cut it all off in a minute with a knife. And this is to stop us from getting glue on unwanted parts of the board, so don't skimp on the tape and don't be fooled into thinking that you might get away with you know, skinny tape or something. Go and buy a roll of nice fat stuff and do it properly. Okay, so now that we've got that tape all nicely under the board, under the pad rather, and nothing can move, we can go around and mark our line. Pushing the pad down as we go, because we want this to be spot on to avoid getting a nasty glue line later. Worth mentioning too here as well, think about your texture. If you've got a bright pink pad or something, you don't want to mark it out with black. You'll end up with a lovely black line around the bottom of the pad that may or may not look stylish, but probably won't look stylish at all. Alright, I'm cutting out, obviously to the inside of the nice fat line, because that's where the pad was. And we're only trying to cut the tape, of course. Very, very light pressure here. Yes, we're going to scratch the paint on the board, but we don't want too much pressure because we don't want to cut through a layer of fiberglass or something and weaken the board. So a new sharp blade with not much pressure, way better than forcing it. Can't remember where I started. There's the tip too. Always start at the centre, at the peak or something like that, so you can remember where you started. But pretty sure we're onto it now. All right. So now we have obviously a perfect line to glue to. Being able to use the nails that are tight to locate the pad so it can't move. So we're going to hopefully avoid that ugly yellow glue line that you see around pads sometimes where people have missed. So we'll go ahead and do the other one and then get into gluing in a minute.
Before. After.
Alright, we just decided to try and get a nicer finish on this because it's such a 90-degree sort of edge. So I thought we'd sandpaper it, and you can see where we've been working on it here with a rough. This is the 80 grade paper I was using before, just to take a bit of that edge off and round it. As I said, this is nicer done with a router, but we're trying to do something that anyone could do and get a good result. Then it's a little bit fluffy, so then hitting it with 240 is giving a really nice smooth result. You could go down to 400 below that if you wanted to, but I think with the 80 being nice and rough to remove lots of material, and then the 240 to kind of polish it off, for want of a better word, you're getting a really nice edge on it. So now we're ready to glue the pads on. Because we need to spread that lovely yellow muck all over the back of it, it's virtually impossible to not get it over the edge there, no matter how careful you are. So we're just going to tape it. I think it took me many years to figure this out, that if you're going to paint something, you would mask the edge, wouldn't you? But I never thought of it when I was gluing. I don't know why. Maybe that's just me, but you know, maybe other people are the same, that You know, you're gluing something and you don't think to mask it like you would when you're painting, but it can save you a lot of grief. So we'll mask around the edges of these and then we'll show you the gluing on process. All right, now we're going to glue the pads on. Same product. Now this again is why I like the slightly runnier product, because we really want to apply it thinly. I could use the scraper as I did before, but that's a little bit too thin. We probably want to get it on about this kind of thickness with no lumps. If you overwork it, as I said, it tends to dry very quickly. So if you start to overwork it, you end up with lumps and bumps. You want to get it reasonably flat as well. The other thing is I put it on the EVA foam first because I think it dries out a little bit quicker on the EVA. Now I know the foam is not porous, but it just seems to take up, I don't know, a little bit of solvents perhaps. It seems to dry quicker on here than the board. I don't know why. But you can spread it a bit thinner on the board. So I normally find doing the EVA first, they kind of dry around about the same time, but maybe that's just me. So in a moment I'll go and spread it on the board for the front pad, and then I'll do the rear pad and the glue on the rear of the board, and then work in that same order when I'm applying them. So, I'm just
Take the edge. No, we don't.
If you try too hard to get it in the holes, some's going to dribble through and you don't really want it on the other side. And thus the masking tape, because if we were trying to paint this on to a line that we drew with texture, we would never be successful. We're gonna, you know, we're gonna end up with it outside the lines. The taping is what's key to a good result.
It's done.
Worth mentioning too, if we miss a bit here, it doesn't really matter, because as long as the perimeter of the pad is stuck down. So I always make sure that I've definitely got glue here. This is where the water's going to hit it and try and lift it. It's also where there's the most curve. It's also where you're jamming your foot in. So if there's one bit you don't want to miss, it's around that rail and heel edge. And think about every board you've ever seen that's had the pads lifting. It's just about always here. So pay a bit of attention to that area if you can. Now applied the glue to the pads and the board. Much like in the first step, we want to wait for this to go tacky to the point where we can't see, that's nowhere near dry enough, it's lifting away. So it needs to be dry enough that we can touch it, but we don't want it to go dry. If we leave this for a day, it's not going to work. So we'll just wait for it to be at that nice stage where I can just touch it, but it's still got a little bit of tackiness to it. And then again, like when we joined these, as soon as it touches, it's bonded. So we'll come back when that's dry enough. Alrighty, our glue is now at a level where we are ready to go ahead and stick the pads on. Probably should have pulled the tape off a little bit earlier while it's still drying, because they're ready to go on now. I don't want to muck around for too long. And as I said, it's at that level where we can sort of touch it, but not too dry. Pick a couple of random holes, but remember which ones we've got. Because now furthest one. Because once this stuff touches, it's stuck, and if you stuff it up, so double check what holes. Sometimes worth having a helper for this bit, because these nails have to be well into the holes. We've got to drop it down. That middle's now bonded, there's no way we can move it, but I'm just going to check around here that I'm on the line. It looks pretty good. And if it's right to here, no point checking the other side because it's too late. So that is now well and truly stuck and permanent. But a good push down. You can save yourself a bit of grief at this point if you're worried by taping around it. I'll do that to show you in a moment, but we really need to get this back one on because it'll be too dry in a moment. So yep, there was my tip, is I should have removed the tape a little bit earlier so I didn't have to hurry so much. Again, trying to pick a nice tight hole so there's no movement. And remembering which one. Okay, we've got the left-hand sides. And we don't want this, again, we do not want this to touch the board until we are sure that those nails are in the foot strap holes and that we got the right ones. Yeah, and here's a good example if you want to go around the back. We want it to line up exactly, and even though we're doing this, look, we've missed a little bit there. So this just needs to be pulled over just a little bit and back a bit. So I'll pull this one back to get it on the line and stretch that pad over there a little bit, because otherwise we would have had that gap with a bit of yellow visible. There's nothing more ugly than having that yellow line around there that looks like you didn't do it right. Next tip, if we peel this, see how it's lifting the glue up? Right in that edge there. So next tip is if we just go around really, really gently with the blade, see that bit it wants to pull?
Yep.
If we go around really gently with the blade beforehand, it just removes that little bit of yellow that otherwise is going to hang out and just look crap. Again, there's your little thing that makes it look, that makes a pro job, so you're not having that ugly yellow glue line. Really, really, really accurate taping, and then afterwards just a really gentle cut with the knife makes all the difference to the neatness of that job. And then, well, actually you can you see there? We've actually missed by 1.5, 2 millimeters there. If you can see the difference between the line and the board. So, however, that tiny little bit of glue that we've got there is going to come away with the blade helping us. So again, this gentle cutting, so we don't end up with the yellow everywhere, certainly improves the result a lot. And that is how we get a neat edge. With the greatest amount of care, and we've still missed by that. That's quite substantial. It's 2 or 3 mil. It's quite a bit.
Start again.
So which is, you know, enabled that glue line to happen. But we'll get that off. Next thing is, I think we're good on this front pad, but I'll tape this one because there's just so much curve. It wants to lift. We don't need to put the board in the water, so we might as well just give it a really solid tape down with the push. Just on those edges there that might want to lift. As I said, this glue bond is permanent and it's immediate, but you know, why risk it? We'll just hold these corners down. Again, a lot of the time, well no, I very rarely would stick it down like this. It's just because there's so much curve. It's got that beautiful hump there for the arch of your foot, which is a lovely shape, but with such a thick pad it just needs a bit to be safe.
So how long will we keep this on before we can take it all off?
Well, as I said, that bond is permanent and strong and good, but to leave it like this overnight wouldn't hurt. So now we'll just go in and neaten up these holes a little bit. Now I'll show you how I do it with a router. You could do it with a Dremel, with a grindstone. Doing it with a V cutting bit in the router is certainly the gold standard, but it's not easy, it's not safe, I'm not recommending it. But we'll show you how it gives a nice result with the countersink to make a nice factory looking pad. Alright, so what I'm doing now is with a router with a V cutter. Obviously this is not designed to work as a plunge router, but that's what I'm doing. And that will put a lovely countersink on the hole, and we will know when we've got to the insert because I'll be able to hear it and I'll be able to feel it. So it gives me a nice chamfer on the hole of the insert as well. But again, I don't recommend this because it's difficult to get right. You might be better off with a Dremel, but we'll give you an example. It's so thick I'm not hitting it. Right, they're so thick that I'm not actually hitting the board. I don't really want to go too much further, but I'm very, very close. But as I said, as you can see, that gives you a really nice finish that's similar to a factory pad for something like the Cobra made boards and such.
So we've now installed the pads, and I left it overnight just to for the glue to set properly, and I'm super happy with the way it's turned out. They're a lot thicker and more cushy than the pads that were previously on the board, so I'm really looking forward to trying it out. One downside of installing thicker pads was it was hard to get the screw into the through the foot strap hole, obviously, because the pads are so thick the screw can't engage into the threaded hole of the board. But once you push down hard on the foot strap and engage it and just leave it overnight, you get these big indentations in the pad. So if you ever change it in the future, it'll be super easy. Okay, so the foot straps are on, and one of the benefits that I didn't think about by putting these thicker pads on, but when I would put my feet into the straps, I'd often just clip the base of the foot strap here, and to the point where I actually fractured my toe a couple of times just trying to like jam my feet in. But because these pads are so thick, when you screw the foot straps in, they countersink into the pads itself. So now it's actually pretty much flush. Sorry, is that focused? Sorry, I can't see. It's countersunk into the pad, as you can see. So that's one less thing to stub your toe on. So that was a nice little side benefit of doing these pads. Cool. All right, I hope you enjoyed the video, and might see you on the water. See you guys. Bye.